Hello, everybody. Today we're talking about economic statecraft, which is just basically, well, it is what it says. It's statecraft using economic sort of levers. I'm also very proud that I made you listen to a podcast in which you now know more about soybeans than you ever have before. By the way, that podcast, Planet Money and The Indicator, those are great podcasts. If you have a podcast sort of thing going, that you have a rotation going, those are good ones to put on there. Um, so let's just talk about what we mean, and then we'll go a little deeper into this. Um, so, what statecraft is the use of instruments to serve foreign policy purposes. So this could be a whole range of things, from diplomacy to military to all this kind of stuff. Almost going back to what we talked about early on in the semester. When we talk about economic statecraft, we mean economic tools, economic relationships. This one makes sense. This one's a little trickier, but in the sense that just, how do I put this? Like, take the example about soybeans that was in the podcast. It wasn't even that China did anything. China just said we might do something, and that caused the soybean prices to fluctuate quite a bit. So without even having official policy, it still made the U.S. feel pain, which could get the U.S. to do something different. So that's the relationship element there. And then we talk about these things, we kind of split them into two categories. There's the positive ones, in which you provide economic rewards for doing something you want, that we want you to do. And then negative, where you have economic punishments, where we punish you economically for doing things we don't want you to do. And then, of course, other military and diplomatic are the main ones that we would sort of fit into other uses of statecraft. We're not going to talk about those. We've talked about those already. And here's another little rule of thumb that's probably not going to be that shocking. Powerful states use economic statecraft more than others. We could also say wealthier states, but they tend to combine a little bit. Where there might be a distinction might be, for example, Japan, which tends to be very wealthy but not very powerful. It will use economic statecraft more than others, just for the obvious reason that it can. So let's do a quick example here. Probably something you've never heard of before, but it was a very big thing at its time. Back in 1974, there was this new amendment that was passed by Congress called the Jackson-Bannock Amendment. So obviously 1974, it's the Cold War. And so what the United States does is the United States does this thing where they grant MFN. MFN stands for Most Favored Nation Status. Most favored nation status to countries that the president certifies as allowing free immigration. So there's a lot to unpack here, so let's just unpack it very quickly. Most favored nation status means that whichever state you are currently having has the best, the most advantageous trade rules, like, for example, the lowest tariffs, things like that. That's called your most favored nation. Most favored nation status is essentially, if you want to reward a state, you say, we're going to give you the deal we're giving this country over here. It's our most favored nation. Now you're a most favored nation too. You get all those advantages, better trade, all that kind of stuff. So it's an economic reward. And again, we'll give it to you if you blah, blah, blah. And in this case, you get it if the president certifies that you allow free immigration. Now let's unpack that for a second. Immigration meaning you let people leave your country. In the 1970s, who wasn't letting people leave their country? The answer was the Soviet Union, and really the whole Soviet bloc. And where exactly was the United States concerned wanting them to go? Well, this is wrapped around Israel. Israel was allowing Jewish people around the world to come to Israel and claim citizenship, to grow their population. And so the United States, on behalf of Israel and against communism, so it's kind of a twofer on this, said any state that does this will get most favored nation status. The goal, of course, was to compel the Soviet Union to let Jews immigrate to Israel. Now, the honest truth is, the United States, or the Soviet Union, was not going to be sort of swayed too much by this. Not only would they not allow They did allow some, but they wouldn't allow like every Jew who wanted to leave, Jewish person to leave, to go to Israel. They, but more importantly, they didn't want free immigration from the Soviet Union. That's why you had the Iron Curtain in the first place, the Berlin Wall, all that kind of stuff. Soviet Union called this an infringement of our sovereignty. Now, is it? Is it an infringement of our sovereignty? That's a tricky one. Because now you think about this. The United States isn't going into the Soviet Union and changing their policies. They're just saying, hey, if you do this, I'll give you a reward. Is that an infringement of sovereignty? If I say to you, hey, if you guys all turn your papers in on time, then I'll give you guys a pizza party. I am not doing that. Just note that. But is that an infringement on your sovereignty to offer you a reward for doing something I want you to do? The answer is probably not. But you can see how invasive these things get, particularly in a country that perhaps requires the most favored nation status, or else their economy will collapse. Now all of a sudden the United States can just basically do whatever they want. This most favored nation status is also key to U.S.-China relations in the 1990s. Let me just explain that very quickly. The United States, okay, so what year was it? 1992 was the Bush-Clinton election. So George W. Bush, well, let me put it this way. One of the big complaints the Democrats had about the Republicans had done most things right in terms of foreign policy, but one of their biggest complaints, in particular liberals, about the defensive realists that were in charge of the Bush administration, was that China, this growing economic power that everybody knew in 10 years was going to be a huge economic power, but at the time was just kind of a growing thing. China allowed a lot of really crappy labor practices. When it came to human rights in China, it was really, really, really bad. It's still not great, but it was super bad back then. And the Democrats and liberal internationalists were saying, we need to stop trading with China and punish them until they clean up their act. And George W. Bush was saying, no. We need to engage with China, and so we're going to give them most favored nation status so that they'll give us some good deals, and because we're going to kind of capitalize on this growing economic power. So Clinton gets elected, and rather than basically saying we're going to put economic sanctions on China, he recognized that China, we needed trade with China, so he ended up giving them most favored nation status in the same way that Bush basically argued for this. So this is part of this ongoing sort of how we do relations with one another. Let's talk about some negative forms. So most favored nation status is one of those positive forms. You could also talk about other sort of free trade arrangements and things like that. There's some negative forms of economic statecraft, and those would be, for example, specific trade restrictions. And that's really, this is the stuff you heard in those two podcasts. We're essentially, we're not going to cut off trade with you. That'd be dumb for both of us. We're just going to cut off trade in an area that's painful to you. And then you'll have to do something about this. If we cut off an area that's not painful to you, it doesn't really do much. And then if you cut off, I think the podcast also talked about this, if you cut off all trade, there's nowhere to go from there. You can't punish any more than that. So if this is all trade, you punish right here, right? And if they don't do something about it, or whatever you want them to do, then you add a little bit more to the mix. Oh, still not doing anything? We'll add a little bit more. Oh, you are doing something? Now we'll take that one away. But we're not going to go all the way back until we know you're going to do this. So this gives you bargaining power and leverage. You can also cut off aid, whether that's military or humanitarian or whatever. You can prevent access to loans from the World Bank or the IMF. Oh man, what country was it? I think it's Iran that has been that is, because of the COVID-19 and all that, they're going to go to the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, in the next month and ask for an emergency loan to keep their economy from collapsing. The United States has been at the IMF saying, don't give them that loan. So this is part of that as well. You can freeze assets that are located in the United States. A lot of, not countries per se, but rich people in countries and politicians in countries and powerful people in other countries have money and investments in the United States. So you can just freeze those things And that can also be a painful thing. Investment restrictions, we don't do that too often, but there are some. Like, for example, if you decide that you want to invest in an Iranian country right now, well, you really can't invest in an Iranian company. There's some restrictions on that. And then, of course, sanctions, whether there's economic, monetary, whatever those things might be, where you just say, nobody trade with those guys over there. Positive forms of statecraft are really just the reverse of these things. Easing up sanctions, easing up on restrictions, unfreezing assets, allowing access, allowing aid, or even increasing aid, reducing restrictions. So these are constantly being sort of leveraged back and forth, positive, negative. And then there's one more set of sort of economic sanction levers, and those are meta levers, like, something meta. And that's about setting the rules of the international economics. It's not that big of a surprise to know that certain rules will advantage some countries more than others. So the process of setting the rules and promising you'll do this or that is also a big part of this. All right, so what I want to do is I want to take a look at, or want us to take a look at, the Iranian sanctions. Remember, we talked about this before, that the United States has put sanctions on Iran because we don't want them to get nuclear weapons. Great. Now the question is, a couple questions here. Do they work? Do they achieve the outcomes that you want? And are there other parts of this that go with this? And so what you're going to do is you're going to read a longer piece, but from the Human Rights Watch, and how they talk about how the sanctions are violating the human rights of Iranians. So you're going to see a list of what those sanctions are, what those levers that we've tried to put in place in Iran are, and then some of the side effects of these things as well. It's not just a simple Iran has an increase in economics or a decrease in economics. There's other things that go with that. And then you're going to look at the COVID-19 situation right now in Iran and whether the United States should ease up on those sanctions during the midst of this sort of crisis.